everyone, Tom Ellsworth with the Biz Doc here with Amy Dangerfield and with a group of colleagues, and we refer to them as colleagues in what we call the great resistance of national polling. The resistance is we have all the people that we're about to introduce have been trying to dedicate themselves, and you may know of some of them that you've seen on X or you've seen on YouTube, or you've seen their content, desperately trying to define for you what is really happening in the polls. Because a poll is not a poll. How it's taken, how it's measured, what's really in it. It's like a bowl of chili. You taste it and it tastes funny, but you don't know why because everything's cooked into the chili. Well, we're here to tell you that we can identify a lot of things that are in there. So we're calling this episode of The Decision 2024 as Meet the Resistance. And first I'd like to have him introduce himself, Mr. Mark Mitchell of Rasmussen.
Hi, everybody. Independent and accurate pollster that's been in the business since 2003. Our bread and butter is public opinion, because if the media is failing you, how else are you going to know what Americans want and the politicians aren't getting the voters what they demand? And we also think we're pretty good at predicting election outcomes as well.
Fantastic. Also with us, you've probably seen him. If you've seen his videos on YouTube, you know he gets very spirited because he's very passionate about just neutrality and accuracy in polling so you can digest and understand what you're consuming. You know, if you listen to him long enough, you might kind of sum it up as, why is it that we have to have ingredients on the back of every food product we buy, even gum, and it's written in 2-point type, yet when it comes time to polling and selecting the leader of the free world, to hell with ingredients, to hell with what's on the back of it. We don't have to tell you. And we love this guy's work. I'd like to introduce Rich Baris.
I'm gonna take that and use that. Thanks for having me. We have our own analogies we try to use. That's a great one. Rich Baris, the People's Pundit, aka the People's Pundit. I'm the director of Big Data Poll. She's going back. Mark said, you got me beat, Mark. But 2010, we authored the election model, the People's Pundit Daily Election Model in 2014 that went public. And then the Daily Tracker in 2016, and been at it ever since. So now I'm basically the host of Inside the Numbers, which you were referring to, and we try to teach people about how polling is done.
Well, and to show that there's hope for the future, we've met the next guest, Mr. Lester Tellez. And Lester is a student at the University of Central Florida who built a model that backed in correctly to the results of the 2020 election. This shows you that there's hope, because there's a new generation of people who are curious and coming forward, trying to make sense out of the polls and not just taking the word of the so-called grown-ups. Lester.
Hello, guys. I'm Lester Tellez from On Point Politics. I'd like to thank Tom Ellsworth and Valuetainment for having me on the show today. So as I've been going through all the polling data, I've realized that pollsters may be making the same mistakes as they've made beforehand. And what I've realized is, looking at modeling that I've backtested to the 2020 presidential election, it seems like Donald Trump may have a pretty decent lead in some of the swing states.
Thank you for your curiosity, and thank you for being part of the next generation, hopefully people that are just in search of truth.
Absolutely. Yeah, we forget this guy's just 20. Shout out to you, Lester. But I do want to ask you specifically, Mark, because we refer to Rasmussen every single week. We always start out our episodes going into the national polls.
With the daily national.
Absolutely. And we refer to Rasmussen, first and foremost, because you guys were rated one of the top accurate pollsters from the 2020 elections. And, our tagline of the show is words talk, but numbers scream. And your numbers have been screaming. So the question that I wanted to ask you is, how does Rasmussen keep its integrity? How do you guys stay so accurate and stay so impartial in a world that is really, filled with spin? There's so many people out there who are trying to paint a narrative according to party lines and what they believe. So how do you stay impartial?
That's a really tough question to answer. I think the real question is, how do people who have lost their integrity allow that to happen? I just don't understand how I could devote my personal, professional energy to something and then sell out. And we run a business. We try to be accurate. If we're going to be non-accurate over the long term, our business will fail. And so every night I stay up at night worrying that my numbers aren't correct. And if we have an outcome that we didn't predict exactly right, we're going to go back in and adjust our models and try and make it better. And there's a lot of measuring sticks that you can measure a pollster by. And we do pretty well in some of them. In others, maybe not so well. But we definitely got slandered as far-right pollsters for basically just showing in 2016 that Donald Trump had a chance. That was not a very popular view to have back then. And then since then, what we've been doing is polling on some third rail topics that make the corporate regime really unhappy. And I think that it's important information that voters need to find out about it. So listen, if that's what makes us far right, fine. But all we're doing is being good journalists.
I really want to take a second to just commend you and say thank you for having that bravery to be able to speak out and share the truth, despite knowing the fact that you're going to be met with so much resistance and so much animosity from people online, specifically people on the left. So thank you for showing that courage and tenacity and bringing people the truth. I'm really curious, what inspired you to actually start your show, to start everything going on with Rasmussen?
I think it was just how much everybody turned from the topics that mattered most to voters over the 2020 period. There were very few people willing to touch the darker parts of COVID. There were hardly anybody that had any curiosity whatsoever in election irregularities, and the numbers are astounding. Gaslighting for 4 years about a safe and secure election did not help the country. I can tell you that right now. In the swing states, 70% of voters think it's at least somewhat likely that the outcome of the election is going to be affected by cheating. And so we couldn't not cover that stuff. And yeah, we absolutely lost business. There are absolutely news media outlets that won't let us come on. There are conservative media outlets whose managing editors will spike stories, and then Washington Post and all of their ilk threw their fact checkers at us. And I guess it's just part of trying to do right by voters.
It's funny. I heard something. All the snide comments come out on X, but sometimes there's truth and humor that is a little uncomfortable. It says, "Did the fact checker call you?" And I said, "What for?" "Well, if there's facts, they really want to check."
There's nobody lower than.
Can't have that. Don't get too close to the truth.
Yeah,
I feel sorry for Glenn Kessler. It must be the lowest rung of the corporate media ladder, being a fact checker assigned to Rasmussen Reports. It's so horrible for them.
Exactly.
So what about you, Lester? For you, what really inspired you to start doing what you're doing?
So, at least for me, in the 2020 presidential election, when I was just 16 years old, I actually used to be way more liberal on certain positions. And once COVID kind of came around, and I think this really affected a lot of people too, it started getting me to really do my own research, in electoral politics and kind of start paying attention more. And as I went through that cycle, I realized that I viewed Donald Trump as more of an effective leader, in my opinion. And so ever since then, that was kind of when I really started paying attention to politics. And in that's when I got really interested in the Electoral College and the history of how states vote and whatnot. And that's how we are here today, where I make videos talking about the Electoral College.
Very cool stuff. So, well, Rich, there's got to be like a kernel of spark, because you come across as a very passionate entrepreneur. I've been a passionate entrepreneur back in the day, and I recognize it when I see it. And obviously, you felt very passionate about something. What was the spark moment where you said, you know what? I'm going to drive this, and it's not going to be a side hustle. I'm really going to go do this, and I'm going to drive this, and I'm going to build this program. Can you take us through the spark, the evolution, that what led you to where you are today? Because you take a lot of heat. You take a lot of heat because you are above the waterline of an individual that people know that when you start breaking it down, the first defense they have is, oh, here he goes again. And I said to myself, whenever I hear that, that usually means you're right, and they're trying to spin it into, oh, you're just unbelievable weird fringe. But what was the spark that led you to today, and maybe a couple of the encouragement points where you said, I'm not giving up and I'm even going to go faster?
Yeah, I think, and by the way, you are right. I mean, there's no doubt. I've always been an entrepreneur, and I've always been passionate just about anything I've done in my life. So I guess it just mixed. And I've always loved politics, but I didn't start in this field, although I always had some political connection, I guess. I loved the process. I was always passionate about it. But It wasn't until I got back to, which I've been to a couple of times because I get bored. Went back to college when I was in my younger 20s, and I went to a place where, and most people know it, the early vote model is. So, when you're nerdy like me, and I was in financial services before, I've always been in numbers, but I didn't use it for politics. I used it for financial stuff. But when you're nerdy like me, you get curious. And I just met the right people, as often that happens. But where really the spark happened is when I decided, you know what, out of entertainment, maybe, we'll try to develop some models, because I was in a place in academia where that's what people did. And maybe I can be more accurate than the boss. And I was. And this is many, many years ago. And over the course of time, I think the best way to describe how this happened to me is that every year there would always be these misses with polls and models, and they would always happen in the same direction, or mostly, I would say. I really believed, as I started to basically train, because you really do have to learn the craft. Polling is not something you can learn in a classroom and then go out and do in the real world. You have to find somebody who knows it, or multiple people in my case that know it, and you have to study under them like you would study a martial art. It really is like that. And in my case, I think I really fell hook, line, and sinker for the Gallup philosophy, which is that in this modern era, we cannot have a functioning, self-governing society if our politicians, if our leaders do not know or understand what the public is thinking. It's the early republic days are over. We're a very large country with a lot of different people. And I really did believe in that vision by Gallup, and I took it very seriously. And it was very clear, very early, that something was wrong. And it didn't seem to me that anyone really had any interest in fixing it. It became a boys' club, and that's just a figure of speech, because obviously it's not all men, although it is dominated by men. But it became an establishment status quo boys' club, and I wanted to smash it because I figured they were doing something harmful to our electoral process.
Completely, and I could see the frustration driving the entrepreneurial spirit. A lot of entrepreneurs that built things out of frustration of a solution that didn't exist. And what you saw was, this could have been solved before, but there's this intentional bridge that's been blown up, and you saw that, and it kind of drove you forward.
I did. There's a couple of problems with the polling industry. Some of it is, Mark and I and other pollsters, we all talk, and some of it is methodologically based, and we hatch it out together. We look at our own stuff after elections, and we're constantly trying to get better. But there's another darker part of this that's problematic. And that is an ethical issue. There's methodological issues, and there are ethical issues. And some of it's driven by echo chambers, and other stuff is not, unfortunately.
Well, that was the perfect segue, because that leads me exactly to my next question that I wanted to direct to all of you, really. What is up with the suppression of the polls? Surely you guys have noticed as well that there have been a lot of polls that have not been publicated, or maybe a specific pollster has released their results for one state that maybe shows favorable results versus another. You're like, well, where's the poll for this state? So what do you guys have to say about the suppression of polls in this election cycle specifically?
I'm newer to the industry. Definitely studied under my replacement here, and I'm seeing a lot of this stuff for the first time. And I was quite frankly appalled by what I perceived to be a lack of polling curiosity into the post-switcheroo numbers. And I was looking around at Real Clear Politics for the first 2 weeks of August saying, where are all the national polls? There were only 2 non-Rasmussen national polls in the Real Clear Politics aggregate between August 1st and August 14th, when they were putting out like 14 polls a week all the way through May, June, and July. And I think that's because a lot of people didn't want to be the ones to come out and say, well, Kamala Harris's numbers aren't exactly as good as the first Reuters Ipsos poll that got put out, and everybody was cherry picking. And then, of course, all of a sudden they started polling again, and week after week after week for about 4 numbers, the numbers kept 4 weeks, the numbers kept shifting left and left and left. And that's just one of the many nefarious things they do. And it's really hard because in every single one of these circumstances, they do have a layer of plausible deniability. I will say that after all the pollsters were horrible in 2020, a lot of them got their budgets cut. Pretty sure that's what happened to poor Nate Cohn at the New York Times. And so they are polling less. literally everybody except I think Morning Consult, who somehow, despite being horrible, got their budget doubled. But you never really know for sure, which is why you always got to look at the crosstabs and have a questioning eye about the timing of some of these things. But I mean, like, I think North Carolina is another very real example where this is happening. Everybody was super concerned about the hurricane. There hasn't been a ton of post-hurricane polling in North Carolina, and maybe it's nefarious and maybe it's not, but it is suspicious.
Can I just add something to that? Because this is a topic that Mark and I have discussed, and so I'm sure he's discussed it with other people. There's also the timing stuff, right, Mark? I mean, there's the timing of releasing a poll 2 weeks after the last interview is conducted. We've seen this. He mentioned Morning Consult, and this is one of the reasons why I'm so hated by most of the people in this industry, because I'm about to do it right now. I don't mind calling. Yeah,
let's go.
Like, Morning Consult is a repeat offender. On top of being one of the worst having one of the worst polling track records and one of the least degrees of transparency in the industry, they have routinely done this during Biden. There you go. During Biden's, the heart of his downfall, before that State of the Union speech, he was trailing Trump. The State of the Union comes out. He does his spiel. 2 days later, we get a round of battleground polling showing that Joe Biden is surging again. Maybe he's tying Trump here in this state. He's leading by a point in that state. Except when you actually get into it, it doesn't make any sense. The headline from Bloomberg says Biden surges after the State of the Union, but the Morning Consult interviews were taken a week, 10 days, 12 days before the State of the Union. And as a pollster, if somebody, a media client that I worked for, tried to take my work and twist a narrative falsely like that, it's incumbent upon you to come out and say, I don't care if you put a small little blurt press release on your website, you put a post on X, a tweet on Twitter right back then. You do whatever you have to do to distance yourself from that kind of deception. And that is now, that was the first of 2 or 3 times that we have seen these narratives get formed based on polling that was withheld and not released. And every pollster would tell you, and I myself have argued that polls do not gyrate wildly the way that we see public polling do. Public opinion doesn't move like that. Of course, it does change, but I'm the first one who will say that. That being said, you still have to adhere to the basic rule that a poll is a snapshot in time. So for you to release the poll 2 weeks later after the last interview was conducted, you're throwing stale data into the average, and you're definitely misleading people.
Makes sense to me.
No, completely understand. It's really kind of interesting. I felt like the Babylon Bee, because about a week ago, I was so tempted, and I try not to be snarky, but sometimes I can't help myself. And I was about to create a post that simply said, it says, Kamala's speech validates polling, right? Where you flip it on the head the other way. Her speech this week validates the polling from 2 weeks ago, rather than the polling 2 weeks after validates the impressions America had of the speech.
That's the point.
Kind of flip it on its head.
That's exactly what's happening. I've been calling it the narrative leads the polls, because it's definitely the switcheroo happened. She got the Obama endorsement, and everybody's, oh, she's so stunning and brave. All this positive press, everybody's talking about the honeymoon. And it wasn't until after that the polling all got permission to move left. And then sure enough, in the news media in the last basically week and a half, 2 weeks, there's been a lot of introspection about how her campaign is imploding. Only now after that do you start to see the polling move back in Trump's direction. And in my opinion, the numbers have basically kind of been locked in a stalemate. And the same thing happened too. You're absolutely right, Lester, about what happened to polling around the debate season, because we were polling continuously during that entire period. And in my opinion and in my numbers, the debate actually moved the numbers closer to Biden, because all the Democrats were like, oh, Lord, Trump might win it. And, we'll call that a response bias or whatever.
Up a little. Yeah.
But what happened is the Real Clear Politics aggregate shot up all of a sudden, more favorable to Trump, because everybody got the message somehow that it's time to dunk on this guy.
It's so funny, and there's merit badges to be had in this. There is a parody account on Patrick Bet David. Some of the parody accounts are almost too perfect, they put a name, but they put the word parody way at the end. So that part of the handle never shows up on X. So as you scan down, you really think it's somebody. But Mark Cuban blocked the parody account, which we found very, very funny. We said, Patrick, Mark Cuban has blocked your parody account.
Genius.
And we're like, he says, it's kind of like a badge of honor when these things happen. Like, there was the transaction for 538. Nobody really understands that outside of the industry of how it really put 538 in a permanent point of corporate corruption. And I hate to say it that way, but it puts them under this fog and this veil because ownership is going to drive behavior. And that's what happened. And your merit badge, Mark, is you and Rasmussen were banned by 538, which was sort of a merit badge because their consolidated polling had so much inconsistencies.
Yeah, we definitely wear this one as a badge of honor. It was self-inflicted and whatever. I like the idea of what Nate is doing. I think there is probably an ability to unskew the bias of polls over time. I don't know how much lift it would add, but the problem is that if you have no discipline or integrity or you're attached to a major corporate media news outlet, it doesn't work. Exactly. And they're owned by Disney. Disney is literally burning every single IP it has for the message. Like, they're definitely going to do it for pollsters too. And they asked us some simple methodology questions. I actually typed out a response to them. And this happened again a month after Nate Silver got fired. I think the timing is kind of incredible. They replaced Nate with this rabid ideologue. And I said, you know what? I probably shouldn't have to answer these questions. I've already answered them publicly. And it felt like a trap. And then I ignored them. And then I got this snotty ultimatum email that gave me 36 hours to respond. And what it automatically became clear in the email is that they are concerned that we associate with right-leaning blogs and online media outlets like Steve Bannon's War Room and Fox News. And are we accepting payment in kind? And is there quid pro quos and blah, 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 all these accusations about our integrity with no evidence. So we said, screw you guys. That's it. We're done.
Absolutely. Because I read the email. It's not like none of us talk. I can tell you right now, nothing like that had ever been sent to Monmouth University. Nothing like that had ever been sent to Quinnipiac. What they wrote to Mark was absolutely outrageous. And nobody ever questions the connection between Gary Langer and the Washington Post at Langer. And I'm not saying that. I'm not making that accusation because there's no evidence to make that accusation. That's the entire point. Yet they went out on such a limb to do this. But at least, Mark, you got banned for that reason. I mean, I was banned right off the rip. I was banned because I came out swinging at these guys. When I came out on the stage, I never tried to play friendly with them. I always called them what they are. It is a scam. There is a really neat little niche subgroup out there that wants to try to make models that predict elections, but these are not models. Nate Silver and his new Silver Bulletin, 538, and them unskewing the polls, they are not doing anything that you folks at home cannot do yourselves. They are aggregating the polls. They are looking at it. They are thinking one poll is more left-wing or right-wing than the other. And by the way, their own bias is impacting their thinking on this because it's not subjective. It's objective that you can go and see the average error for Mark's polling in the last, 4, 8, 12 years. You can do it for me as well. For some reason, they can routinely give more weight to pollsters that have been among the least accurate pollsters out there. And when we started to question them on that, they began to use terms like high quality, low quality. These are censorship terms because they cannot go toe to toe with like Mark or me or Robert Cahaley from Trafalgar or Jim Lee from Susquehanna. They cannot go toe to toe with us on our track records. So instead, they have to build up these like little words and censorship words that are basically like cancel culture, and they apply that to try to take you out or to try to take you out of the discussion or to try to reduce your credibility in the space. And it really is no different than what they do in the height of social media banning. It's no different. That was the template for it.
Yeah. That's why they got rid of Nate. Nate knew that it was a great way to get traffic. It was a good business idea, captures a lot of eyeballs. This new guy realized it's a fascistic information gatekeeping operation.
Yeah,
and just even looking at the rating should be enough to know they rate ABC news poll number 2. There's no way. That's
Biden plus 17 in Wisconsin in 2020.
Oh my, I didn't know that.
Biden plus 17.
Yeah.
And by the way, Mark, what happened there. The ABC News Washington Post poll was conducted by Gary Langer, and he had his methodology that he used for years at Langer Research. He began to put out Trump plus 6s, and then when the Trump plus 12 came out, they canned him, they put him on the bench, and now they use the same panel as Reuters, which is one of the worst panels you can pick in the industry. Obviously, the track records show that, and they have him, if you read the methodology statement, they say that Gary's overseeing collection and field work. That really means he's been canned and he's been sent over to the bench, and they're going with the Reuters Ipsos panel, which is, again, not a
Venture Folger's number 287.
the one of what, 3 or 4 of us that got 2016 correct, and we're within the margin in 2020 because, again, this is why we do Inside the Numbers. It doesn't matter if Robert got Michigan, or let's use Wisconsin. If he had a Trump plus 1 in Wisconsin, but Biden eventually won Wisconsin, he's still more accurate than Gary was with a Biden plus 17. It's not about who's really, and I know people don't want to hear this, but it's true. It's not about who accurately projected the winner when we're talking about margins like this. It's about the margin. Did you overstate one of the candidates outside of the margin? And then the other fishy thing, folks, that is probably the biggest red flag in the industry is how many cycles in the era of Trump, all of these errors are in one direction. All right. In our polling in 2020, we overstated Biden a little bit in Minnesota. We overstated Trump a little bit in Arizona. If you have a solid methodology, one that is not being influenced by your own biases or whatever, your own confirmation biases, then that should happen. Statistically, I don't want to get in the weeds, but you should not have misses in one direction. There's something fundamentally wrong with your methodology if you do. And year after year, here's where the ethical stuff really comes in. Year after year, they do, and they don't adjust it, and they don't do anything. So it's like after a while, you're guilty by like sticking your head in the sand, right? Yeah. So, all right, right, Mark. So you have a problem after 16. You don't do anything about it, right? And you just let it go. 18.
No, the problem gets worse.
No problem, right?
Right. Problem gets worse. And then they'll say, oh, but Romney. Oh, but Romney.
Oh, yeah.
No.
Oh, but 22. Oh, but we got some right in 18. Okay. Yeah. But those are midterm elections, and they're very, just so folks at home understand, it is very different to poll a midterm election versus a presidential election. And the reason why they keep it's so serious that they keep missing the Senate races specifically in midterm elections, even then when it's a more limited electorate. So it's a different population that you're surveying compared to the nation overall in a higher turnout election. But the reason it's so bad that they miss these Senate races is because, of course, the presidential election is really a bunch of state elections decided by the Electoral College. It's not a national election, right? It's not a national referendum. So when they get J.D. Vance 6-8 points wrong, it's going to be a problem in 24 when we get to Ohio, right? So when they bury their heads in the sand like that, and Baris, for instance, doesn't say, I guess I got a problem polling the Midwest. I haven't accurately polled a state correctly in 10 years. I'm not even joking. I mean, I'm not even being, I'm not being facetious. I'm not being hyperbolic. I mean, they have missed all of these Midwestern battleground states for a decade, and you don't do anything about your methodology. Then there comes a point where you have to say, are you doing this intentionally, or even if you're just burying your head in the sand, are you doing that intentionally on some level, right? Is it the boss that wants it? Is it the media outlet you work for that wants it? The university, where do they get their money from, guys? Right? Who's filling their coffers with those grants? What do those donors want? Right? So are you burying your head in the sand because of that? And, I mean, again, doing nothing is just the same as being guilty if you know you have a problem.
1,000%. And it's so interesting the way that's distilled even onto the average person as well, because again, we quote Rasmussen in our polls and there'll be a bunch of people in the comments, oh, that's a right-wing skew. Yet when we talk about Quinnipiac polls, which were rated one of the lowest accurate pollsters out there. Nobody says anything about that, right? So it's interesting the way that they distill that into the mind of the viewer as well, into the average person. And so on that note, what I wanted to ask you, and Rich, you did go into it a little bit, but for the average person, right? You say, you can do this for yourself. You can figure out the bias yourself and really analyze this stuff as the viewer at home. What are some of the key things that they can really look out for? And I know you mentioned a couple there, but if you want to just go a little bit more in depth, and I'd love to hear from the other people on the panel as well, in terms of the last 4 weeks of polling, what is the number one thing that people should be looking out for in terms of polling accuracy?
Yeah, we're all out of conventions. We're all out of VP choices. We're all out of like big milestones happening. It's from here in, unless there's some dirty trick or something, October
Dirty
surprise, which, they've exhausted the surprises, it seems. But what can those average people expect to see, you think, in the next 3 weeks?
So I think too, when it comes to polls specifically, Real Clear Politics has now begun to put up pollsters. They haven't done everybody yet, but I know that they are adding people as we speak. I'm sure they're trying right now. They do have a nice little tool that helps people, go back and look at the track record of a pollster. Again, we all have them. But the thing that if you're digesting polls and you're looking at polls right now, you got to look at those survey field dates. That's number one. Because there was a lot of this. The Cook Politico polls, I'm not saying they weren't done well. I'm simply saying they were done a week and a half before you saw them. And then they were put out as if like that was the trajectory of the race. A lot of these polls now, Mark, I'm sure you saw this. A lot of them are dumping their final polls in the beginning of October and in like October 11th. Marist poll just did it. Marist poll's final poll was 11-1. In the last 2 cycles. So why would you be now not polling anymore and dumping a last minute final poll? But again, look at the sampling error. I can't stress this enough. Everyone has gotten used to a pollster saying Biden +2 or Biden +4, and they really think that means that this pollster, it's that likely that Biden's going to win that state by 2. We all have sampling errors. You should look at the size of those sampling errors. Morning Consult with their battleground states. That's 400 interviews each state. That's nothing. As Mark will tell you, they will be wildly gyrating if you have a sample size that small. So, survey dates, track records, and sample sizes. And because that dictates the sampling error. That is what people should focus on the most. It is. And the trend, of course, as I'm sure all three of us will tell you, that trend at the last minute, it matters.
Yeah, and it definitely matters 100%. And what's very interesting is I'm sort of a Nate Silver, but more of an honest way. I automatically grade all pollsters based on the margin from 2020, the sample size they currently have in the aggregate, the amount of undecideds they have, as well as whether or not they're using a likely voter screen or not. And so when I do that for the last month of polling in 2020, I get Biden +4.9. Right now, I'm doing the same thing going back a month, and I have Trump up a couple points in the popular vote. Now, unlike Nate Silver's gyrating model that's gone back and forth a billion times, I've consistently found even since August that Donald Trump has led in the national popular vote as of right now. And I think it's important for there to be a source of somebody that's actually honestly grading pollsters, not Nate Silver giving Rich an F because he doesn't like Rich for whatever reason, or 538 kicking out Mark because they feel like, he's possibly getting some Russian money from whatever he does, whatever shows he does on the far right, whatever it is. So I think it's important for somebody that is out here honestly getting all the pollsters together and saying, okay, how wrong were you in the last cycle? And if you were wrong, you're going to get less of a score because there's other people that not only were right last time, but have been right in 2016. Like you, Rich, you put out the best Michigan polling. And now you have Trump up by almost 4 in Michigan. And that's very similar to what I have right now. And you had Trump probably up, I think it was 0.6 in the final poll in Michigan.
16? You got it. It was like 0.4, something. 0.6 in Pennsylvania. 0.6 in Pennsylvania. Yeah.
Literally, that's almost perfect. So right now, I think it's important for someone to be out there actually honestly getting all the pollsters together, creating an aggregate that even if they're not going to fix their issues, someone can come in and say, okay, look, I've gotten all the party IDs of all the polls. This is what I think the electorate's going to be. We're going to weigh it to that and see what ends up being correct. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong.
Lester, for posterity, I'm being told that you are right. It was a half a point rounded up to 1 in Michigan in 16. Just got to get you right. I'm being told that you were right.
Yeah.
I'm wrong. It wasn't 0.4. It was either 0.5 or 0.6. So, okay, you got that. Lester knows my record better than I do. Good job, Lester.
Well, so it's very interesting you were talking, Rich, and I'm going to ask you, Mark, if you had the reaction. Over the weekend, Amy and I dug into, along with our analysts, all these Wall Street Journal polls came out, but it was like they were all 600 registered voters, 600 registered voters, 600 registered voters, running the gamut of the battleground states, and some of them the spreads were like wide, like candidate
6 in
candidate
Nevada.
5, 6 in Nevada, and you look at that and you go, doesn't that pass a sniff test? So, and Mark, to you, did you see those particular polls? Because Wall Street Journal, boy, it's, people think of the Wall Street Journal. They must be right because it's like a news source that people assume Murdoch owns them. They're all right-wing crazies.
No,
or some,
they probably
or
hate
some
Trump
feeling.
too.
But then all those come out. Wouldn't a disciplined, recipient of that, the customer at the Journal, looking at that, wouldn't they look at some of those and say, wow, a 5-point plus in this particular, that just doesn't smell right. And all of them were 600 RV rather than likely voter, like a 1,100 likely voter, which other people have been running to get like a 2% margin of error. Suddenly they're running this out and openly saying, yeah, it's like a 4.1 margin of error.
So many things to say about that. And I'll say that there are multiple layers of levers in which bias can be applied to pollsters. And one of them is definitely where the pollster reports, how close of a relationship. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what's going on as far as the Wall Street Journal. A lot of these media organizations might get a vendor for the pollster and just totally allow them to do whatever. I think there's things that are like New York Times where that guy probably reports up to a managing editor that determines what his top line is, and he just has to put the crosstabs out, whatever they say. But I'm actually more suspicious when I see statistical herding, where everybody has all of the swing states within a statistical tie, than I would be seeing a small sample size like that swing all over the place. I think it's actually pretty fair. 600 likely voter poll or registered voters, you're going to see a 3 or 4 point margin of error, which means if it's tied, you're going to see +4 to -4. And I think what we're seeing now is everybody's kind of like trying to duck calls. At least they were up until about 2 weeks ago. But I want to talk about, we said this a little bit before recording. I want to tell people how to look at polling in a way that will accomplish two things. One, make the dialogue better on Twitter, and two, piss off Nate Silver. So Nate Silver will tell you that he doesn't want you to be a cross-tab diver. He wants you to cede rational thought about polling to the experts. And that's the same as saying, no, you're not allowed to watch a movie and have your own critical take. You need to see what the Wall Street Journal movie critic says about that movie. And that's totally false, because anybody can watch a movie and compare the merits. And so people may not have heard this term, but the term is called crosstab. You've probably explained it to this audience. But it isn't just the top line number, which is Trump or Harris winning. It's all of the other questions in the poll and how the demographics break down for each one. So how did Hispanic voters go? How did Trump 2020 voters vote this time out? And you can get at those crosstabs for almost every pollster directly from Real Clear Politics. It links there. They all kind of look different, so it takes some time, which is why me and Rich honestly don't have the time to do this for every single one. Yep. We would love the help for people out there dunking on horrible polls. But at the end of the day, you're watching a movie and subjectively comparing the merits. And you say, okay, well, Rasmussen has Trump winning nationally. And oh, look at that. Trump's winning by 5 to 10 points among independents. But then you go to like a Reuters Ipsos poll and you're like, oh, they have Harris winning independents. Which makes more sense based on the fundamentals of the polling? Well, right track, wrong direction is horrible. The economy's not great. People say they don't like the Biden administration. Bidenomics was a failure. They say that Kamala Harris is more of the same by massive majorities. especially independents, 2-1. So when you look at things inside those polling crosstabs, you'll see things that don't match reality or that don't look the same from one poll to another. And another example is the ABC polling always has Donald Trump a horrible approval rating, favorability rating. They have him at 33%. They have Kamala Harris at like 46, 47. There's a 25-point net favorability sandbag on Donald Trump in their poll, which makes absolutely no sense because Donald Trump won more votes than any Republican candidate in history. And they only have Harris up, whatever, +3, +4 with that massive sandbag. So people, if they want to spend the time, will find millions of these examples that they can put on Twitter. And I would recommend that they do hashtag crosstab diving and tag Nate Silver in it. I would really love if I could see a lot of those over the next 2 weeks. I think it'd be hilarious.
Mark, that's why we call the show Inside the Numbers. We don't want people to scrutinize every single demographic. But when you're looking, like Mark is picking some like glaring examples. When you look inside the poll and the poll shows we know Biden won the popular vote by a little over 4 points. When you look inside the crosstabs and you can see that the recalled vote or their vote preference history is an electorate or the sample itself from that pollster, from that particular survey, the electorate is significantly more pro-Biden. So you can get a Biden +8 or a Biden plus even more. Like FAU had Trump's vote share from 2020 at 39%. So that's how much, sandbag is a good word. That's how much that sample was sandbagged in favor of Harris. The recalled vote itself does not make the poll wrong, but when you have many of these things, glaring examples in the crosstabs, maybe Trump is only winning the white working class by 5 points. Well, then you got a problem. If the ideology of the sample, if you have all these issues and then ideologically it's like 30% liberal and only 30% conservative, then you have a problem. So
Harris wins the rural vote. Yeah.
Yeah. So Fox News, can we just say that? Can we just say it out loud? Fox News. All right. I mean, Harris is not going to win the rural vote. They had Trump and Harris basically close in urban America and Trump losing the rural vote by 2. That's absurd. I mean, that is a problem with how that poll was conducted. And yet, I mean, they don't want you to crosstab dive because, folks, just like any expert out there, if you educate yourself to the point where you don't need that expert to tell you what's up, what's down, what's left, what's right, is this the color blue or the color green? You tell me, Mr. Expert. Right? If you don't need them anymore, then their relevance ceases to exist. And I guess that's a part of one of the reasons why, and you guys called it the resistance. I guess that's part of one of the reasons why they come at you so hard, because you are, in fact, when we're doing what we all do, you are in fact threatening their very reason for existence and their very relevance, especially when they're wrong year after year after year, and they're trying to dismiss the criticisms that you levy year after year after year. Eventually, too many people are going to catch notice, so they just would rather you not look at all.
Yeah, and to add to Rich's point, and I mean, with Nate Silver, I mean, with all due respect, man, like my whole thing now is looking at the crosstabs, which for my 2020 aggregate, I can get Biden +4.9, which RCP had Biden +7.2, 530 had Biden +8.4. So even though I'm using sort of an unorthodox way of looking at party ID and kind of skewing it a little bit in order to get more accurate results to the electorate, I'm able to get a better average than the two top people were able to get an average for. So I think saying that, actually the crosstabs don't matter because, they really don't make a difference, I think it's just kind of a shame to say. And I think that really does a disservice to even publicizing, the polls out to the public, because what's it for to publicize the polls if you're going to tell people, don't look at the crosstabs because, we know better.
Right. What are you doing it then for, Lester? Right.
Yeah.
Like, why does APOR have the basic standards of disclosure if they mean nothing? If one of these most important critical points of transparency mean absolutely nothing and are useless. And I just want to give people a distinction. All right. Their sampling errors for subgroups are higher. So if you see Trump doing a little bit better with like non-whites, for instance, but then he's doing worse with whites. I mean, in the end, as long as it's not ridiculous outside of the, realm, like some of the examples Mark brought up, then things tend to iron themselves out and the polls relatively right, within the ballpark. So it's not like eating
You
away.
can't nail every demographic.
Yeah, right. But when you see multiple issues, glaring examples, obviously that's what the crosstabs are for.
Yeah, week after week, the independents going Harris in the same poll over and over again
against the consensus. Which is, with the consensus, that's why we put polls into tranches inside the numbers. We give them bold. Look, it's my bit of a Wall Street background. We put them in bold tranches and bear tranches. Are you more bullish on this candidate or are you more bearish on this candidate? And we're measuring them against the consensus. And that can identify trends and it can identify biases in the polls themselves. So we think that's helpful to help people understand that. And just to bring up, to piggyback off what Lester was saying, the problem with 538, what Nate Silver does is attempt to unskew the polls the way they want them, right? Not against how accurate they really were, against some super secret sauce that no one's allowed to know what's in it. How did they make this thing? What were the ingredients? You're not allowed to know. It's the most non-transparent thing in the industry. And
he changes it every week.
He changes it all the time. And Real Clear Politics was more accurate than 538. In all of these recent elections. So this idea that he needs to do this is ludicrous. Real Clear Politics is the OG of polling aggregates and polling averages. And they have a very simple rule: no stale data. And that's it. And that's honestly probably the more objective way to do it if you're simply trying to show people an aggregate, not a model, an aggregate.
Well, thank you so much to the resistance. Thank you, all of you, for being here. So, parting shot in a condensed way. We'll start with you, Mark.
I in no way think this election is over. I don't think it's that long to the election, but I do think that there is a major regime, for lack of a better word, who has powerful interests that has proven time and time again they do not want Donald Trump in office. And there are definitely things that they can do in order to cement a win. Some of them sound pretty extreme, but we've also seen 2 assassination attempts. Everybody saw Carter in the news, didn't look too healthy. That might give him a win. Joe Biden, a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. Maybe he gets convinced to resign. That could still give them a win, and they have a miraculous ability to turn out exactly what they need to turn out, where they need to turn it out. All that being said, in our polling the entire time, despite anything you heard in the mainstream media news, our numbers have showed that Donald Trump is basically up 2 points in the national popular vote. It swung around a little bit. Maybe it'll tighten. But at the end of the day, that's saying that he's done better this time out than he has in any of the previous cycles. And he won at least one of those cycles as well. In our polling, all the swing states look like a statistical tie, although they're all starting to break Trump. I think North Carolina is off the table. I think Pennsylvania looks like a solid win. That is not what Kamala Harris people want to hear. And quite frankly, unless she gets one of those exogenous shocks or acts of God, I think what we're just going to witness is more like what we did last night, desperate flailing because they don't understand that they have to reach independence and they can't break outside of their own gaslighting bubble to acknowledge the failures and put out real policy things that convince people that they should earn their vote.
Completely. Lester?
To end this off, looking at the race right now, nationally, I have about a 3-point race for Donald Trump ahead in the national popular vote. Looking at my own national aggregate, which grades all pollsters automatically and mathematically without any subjective grading, shows me that Donald Trump is up. Alice Intel, Big Data Poll, Rasmussen Reports, they're all showing either anything above a tie national popular vote for Donald Trump right now, specifically a 2 to 3 point race. And if that's the case, the swing states are over for Kamala Harris. And that's what I'm currently seeing right now in the general election. And as for the few weeks to come, Donald Trump does surge at the end of October. And so I'd say to really be paying attention to how the polls are looking, but specifically how they were looking on this day 4 years ago, compare the aggregates, see who was wrong before. And if you do that, I'm almost certain you'll have a good idea of what's going to happen on November 5th.
Rich?
I really just want to echo what Mark just said. Nothing's really ever over till it's over, and she has a massive financial advantage over him. That being said, the get out the vote really has to be about something. And Alex Castellanos had said it very well when Clinton couldn't do it, even with the money in 16, which is that, you can build a church, but if God's not there, then all you have is a barn, or basically, right? So there's no motivation behind getting people to go out to vote, then you have a problem. Trump is also ahead on trust to handle the most important issues. We call this mood of the electorate. That is one of the variables we've long had in our modeling. He has had a consistent lead over the Democratic nominee for the better part of a year. Now, it does look very tight in the battleground states, but this is why I stayed in the field for as long as I did last week, all the way into this week, because I did think I saw movement at the end, and I recognize this movement. I've seen it before. I saw it in 20, and at the end I saw it in 2016, and at the end I saw it in 2020. Whether it was enough or not, it really is irrelevant. Trump strongly closes at the end, and he seems to be closing, with that kind of strength a little bit early. Well, earlier, not too early, but earlier than he has. And if you're if you want to be anywhere going into a presidential election, you want to be the one with the momentum 3 weeks out. You don't want to be the one who peaked too early in August or September, which appears to be what Kamala did. So I think Trump's in the driver's seat. It's close, but he's in the driver's seat. That's how I'd put it.
And Amy will have the parting shot for us, and then I'll just give you a big thank you.
For me, listen, we have been digging into the polls every week. We've been digging into the crosstabs every week. A lot of people say, who cares about the polls? You should care about the polls because of this conversation, because there is data that you can take from it. You can extrapolate yourself. You can dive into the crosstabs and you can figure out what is the objective truth. There's a reason our tagline is words talk, but numbers scream. The numbers have been screaming. And, unless there's any type of October surprise or something that is, the Dems spin on the left, which is kind of controversial territory that we don't like to speak about too much. But unless something like that happens, we really see it as a victory for Trump. So, I'm just excited for the next 3 weeks to come. I'm excited for it to be over for our election party. Hopefully, if you guys can get out to Florida, you guys may be able to make an appearance. That would be awesome. But yeah, I'm just really excited to see what's to come and for us to start cleaning up this mess. That's what I really hope for.
Well, thank you, Rich Baris, People's Pundit. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark Mitchell, Rasmussen. Thank you for everything you're doing every week. People that can see you. And thank you, Lester Tellez, On Point Politics. Really appreciate it. And this is the resistance, ladies and gentlemen. You can be part of the resistance too by simply opening up the news that you read and saying, why is that? Mm-hmm. And go into the back and go into what we call the crosstabs and say, why is that? The same way you would pick up a jar of peanut butter and look at the back and see what's in it. Is it really all natural or not? You can do the same thing with polls and news that you can do with a can of Coke and a jar of peanut butter. Mm-hmm. Go look.